And I'm in there one day and I see the retired veterinarian back in there with his lab coat and stethoscope on. And I was like, why is he here? Like he's retired. He sold the veterinary practice. He should be, doing whatever retired people do. And it was because the stock market had collapsed so much, and many people's entire life savings were like cut in half. And that's when I was like, oh, like not only are these other concerns here, I'm also now thinking financially, if I stay on this path, am I going to be okay in 30 years?
Welcome to the Vet Life Reimagined podcast. My guest today is Dr. Michael Bugg. I first heard Mike's name from a mentor several years ago. Michael Bugg has a very different career path, which he's known for, as well as his interest in different mindsets around money and finances. For some context, this episode was recorded at the end of 2022, soon after Mike had his second child, baby Ethan, and it was also before his book was published, but his book is now available. I ordered my copy and it just came in this week. Mike and I get into some great deep discussions, so I decided to break this conversation into two parts. Part one will go into Mike's very unique career path, one very different from anything we've had on the podcast before. Then in part two, we will talk more about his book called You're Going to Get Peed On, very catchy, and more about the different mindsets around money. It's all very fascinating and a conversation we need to have more in our profession. So, on to the conversation. When did you first know you were interested in getting into veterinary medicine?
So for me, a little backstory, I grew up on a farm here in Western Canada. Beef cattle was kind of our main thing in grain. Tons of pets, tons of cats. Dogs. So I loved animals as long as I can remember. And basically my life would be get off the school bus, run out to the barn, play with my 4-H steer, play with the dogs, play with the cats. So animals were always like very central part. And then kind of growing up on the farm and seeing the veterinarian come to the farm. And it was like, in a lot of ways, it was like a superhero, like those 3 a.m. C-sections. And as a kid, those are just so exciting. Like your parents let you get out of bed, you go watch. And that was always when I kind of had the idea of like, this is pretty cool. Like maybe I should do that. And then I was doing pretty good in school. So people were always pushing me to like aim big, right? Like you should be a doctor, you should go be a doctor. And I was like, I don't want to be a doctor, but like, why don't I be a doctor for animals? So it wasn't as if I like had it on my wall forever that like I'm going to be a veterinarian. It was more something that like it was a good fit and I really loved animals. And that's kind of how I went into the path and into university with the idea of becoming a vet.
And I have overheard from your podcast with Jonathan that vet school was actually quite fun. And when I was listening to your stories of vet school, I am thinking, where was I? Where was that when I was in vet school? So I really am interested to hear, what was your vet school experience like? How did you embrace it?
Well, I guess, yeah, I probably took a little more cavalier approach to vet school. I definitely had a lot of fun. I was quite young, so I got into vet school when I believe I was 19 years old. So I was kind of like 17 years old into university, the 2 years required straight into vet school at 19. So I was still pretty young and still working out a few of the little party kinks. My experience was great. Like our class of 2008, so many great people in there. We had a lot of fun, a lot of social activities, a lot of bonding. It was hard, right? Like academically, it was humbling. Like I came in as quite a high average student and all of a sudden those grades are just plummeting. But somehow I kind of, found peace in that. And I was kind of like, I don't need 90s anymore. Like I was just like, whatever, I'm going to just accept it for what it is. And, keep on moving through the years. That was always kind of the goal. Get to next year, graduate. But for me, it was a lot of fun.
Well, the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because a lot of people, when they are trying to give advice to veterinary students, I think one of the big pieces of advice people give, and myself included, is to have fun. Don't forget to have fun. And so it was so refreshing to hear somebody talk about having a lot of fun in vet school, despite, yes, it is challenging, but you embraced building relationships with other people in your class. And I think that is one of the things that I don't want people to forget. So thank you for letting me bring that up. So yes, in Canada, it's a little bit different than in the United States getting into vet school. It's still important to study. It's still important to try hard, but to not forget to have some fun. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, if I was to do it again, I definitely wouldn't change it. Like if anything, I would network more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because like it is the relationships that you build and can bring those out into the real world. Like I've forgotten a lot of the like very nuanced technical, like, first year, second year stuff that you studied and memorized for an exam. That stuff has left me, right? But like the relationships, those last forever.
Yes. Now, when you went into vet school, did you have an idea of what you might do in veterinary medicine? And was that the same by the time you were leaving vet school?
So yes, and this is something I did poorly. I had a very narrow view, and it was good because I was very certain, right? I grew up on a mixed farm. I was going into vet school to be a mixed animal veterinarian, and I was going to, move back and do beef cattle and a little bit of cats and dogs. And that was the type of veterinarian I was going to be, like a clinical mixed animal veterinarian. And I was certain of that. And all my, like, even into fourth year, all my electives were like sort of geared around that, taking like beef rotations and whatnot. Got out into, the real world, started doing mixed animal practice, still really love cattle, like loved doing the cattle work. Really didn't love, some of the lifestyle aspects that came along with that. Right. And, Saskatchewan is a large geographical province. So, you'd be on the road all hours of the day, all over the place, in the middle of the night. And I kind of didn't realize, when I was a little boy watching that veterinarian swoop in at 2 or 3 in the morning, and it's so exciting for me. I never, ever once thought like, oh man, like they had to get out of bed, in the cold winter, drive out to our farm, drive back, get 2 hours of sleep, get up, and then go be back at the clinic for 8 a.m. Like that never crossed my mind.
So what did you decide to do? You're starting to notice, I'm not loving this lifestyle. How did you transition into your next step?
I mean, there was a few components to it. So one was like the lifestyle. The other component, I started looking at, career mixed animal veterinarians. And unfortunately, they were really beat up, like physically, right? Like it takes a toll, like all of the kicks and all the bumps from these huge animals. And I was like, man, I don't want that. Like, I don't want my body to be so beat up after 30 years. And then the big one was, it was like 2008. So I'm officially a veterinarian and I'm working in the vet clinic. And I'm in there one day and I see the retired veterinarian back in there with his lab coat and stethoscope on. And I was like, why is he here? Like he's retired. He sold the veterinary practice. He should be, doing whatever retired people do. And it was because the stock market had collapsed so much, and many people's entire life savings were like cut in half. And that's when I was like, oh shit, like not only are these other concerns here, I'm also now thinking financially, if I stay on this path, am I going to be okay in 30 years? And that was really the catalyst that got me exploring, on the personal finance and the investing piece. So I started diving into things and thinking like, man, I got to change some stuff up here. Right. And then so my story goes on and I found real estate investing, started investing in real estate. And as that started taking off, I started actually paring back like the number of hours I worked in a veterinary clinic.
Okay. So when you were trying to look more into the financial side of things, where did you go first? Like how did you know where to start with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So back then, I mean, it wasn't like it is now. Like the internet is so much more developed. There's so many podcasts, YouTube, like you can find information everywhere now. It was mostly books, like the classic Rich Dad, Poor Dad. That was kind of the classic catalyst that got my mindset changing. So for me, it was books off the start.
Okay. Did you encounter anyone else in the veterinary space that was were having similar thoughts, or did you feel kind of like an island there?
That's a good question. Oh, I encountered people that were having similar thoughts. It wasn't broadly talked about like it is now. It was more like, if you were one-on-one in a back room, like kind of a whisper conversation, like, hey, are you feeling, kind of trapped here? And it'd be like, yeah, but you're almost embarrassed to admit it. It wasn't as broadly talked about as it is now. I had not found any, say mentor that had done what I've done. Since then, I've stumbled across a few other medical professionals that have branched off and done other things. But at that time, it felt like I was sort of blazing my own trail.
Mm. And first of all, that's to be commended. It is never easy to do something where you feel like you're having to blaze the trail in doing so. And let me ask you the question, for other people who are having these concerns, what do you think is preventing them from taking a step? Why do you feel like and you say it's talked about more now, but why do you think there's such a hesitation to do something different?
This is only my personal opinion here, so I don't want to speak on behalf of the veterinary community. For me, it was identity. You grow up, you go to vet school, you go through vet school, you put in all the years, and eventually you are a veterinarian. Everyone knows you as a veterinarian. And not only that, a very positive thing, or at least for me, was most people really respect veterinarians, right? You're kind of put on a pedestal. It's very romanticized. And to be honest, that was part of the draw for me. When I was deciding what profession am I going to go into, I really loved, all the admiration that came when it was like, oh, Mike's going into university. He's going to be a veterinarian. And everyone loved that. And so that identity piece was really hard to shake. It's not like I've boycotted it and I'm not a veterinarian. All I'm saying is I've expanded it. I'm not only a veterinarian, right? That makes up a part of me, but it's not all of me. And that was really, really difficult. Right? When I first started whispering to people I'm going to stop working full-time and I'm going to start working part-time. And they'd be like, well, why? What's wrong? There's not a medical reason for me to step back. I just want to. And they would be like, what? That's absurd. You're in your 20s. If you were 60 years old, that would be allowed, but it's not allowed now. And then when I was like, okay, I'm going to stop working part-time, I'm actually not going to do clinical veterinary medicine anymore. A portion of people were flabbergasted, right? They're like, how can you do that? You worked so hard for that degree and you're not going to do surgery anymore. And that identity piece was really hard to shift.
So how did you do it? How did you shift? What were your steps, your thought processes? What'd you do? I'm diving in.
Yeah, it was definitely a journey. So I kind of have a saying or a theory. I feel like people are driven either by desperation or inspiration. And for me, it was definitely desperation. So now we're fast forwarding in my career. I believe this was around 2017 or 18. And so my wife, Rosalie, obviously we live together. She gets to see me every day. And to be honest, I was getting burnt out with clinical veterinary medicine, and I would come home and be exhausted and not very pleasant to be around. And one day she said to me, she kind of coined the moniker Miserable Mike, and it was something that she had said in passing, but it really landed with me. I really don't identify as that. But she was right. So this happy-go-lucky guy that loves to play pranks and joke around and smile, all of a sudden, if I'm being honest with myself, most of the time I was miserable. And that was kind of the catalyst to hey, you got to make some changes here. No one wants to be miserable. So I started, into the personal development world. I joined some masterminds, and it was really making me look at all parts of my life. So this part has nothing to do with clinical medicine and surgery. That's not where this change occurred. This change occurred outside of the veterinary clinic, right? And getting really intentional of okay, if this is not working for you, what would work for you? What might an ideal day look like? Okay. And then stepping back, what would I have to do to create that? Right. And so just piece by piece, and that took years. And I'm still working on that, right? Like that will be a lifelong journey. But that was kind of the bottom of the valley. And then in there, I started kind of climbing out of it, layering on different things. Honestly, that ignited something in me where I like working with animals. Like I like surgery. I love this. When I'm talking with other veterinarians and being like, hey, how can we design a life that you love? I could do that all day.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of that is going back to the identity piece. And I think maybe you and I mentioned this a little bit in a previous conversation about how we put very external things as our identity, such as being this title of veterinarian and being in a clinic, when that is just part of what we do, not necessarily the entirety of who we are. And so being able to step back, like you said, outside the clinic is who am I? Who is my identity? What do I see as values? What is a wonderful day to me? And assessing those, I think sounds like that is how you are able to figure out you first. And then what can you do to enhance that identity? Is that correct? Am I following?
Yeah, we kind of grow up and we have all these ideas of what we should be. And sometimes, we just start living those without stopping and being like, did I choose that? Was that my choice? Or did that idea just sort of get suggested to me and I accepted it and ran with it?
Yeah. I listen to a lot of the personal development things as well. And I once heard the phrase, the shoulding all over yourself. For some reason that stuck with me, right? I think we tend to do that a lot. I just think that some of the types of people that come into veterinary medicine, we tend to be very hard on ourselves. We are often some of the tops of the class. We are, achievers. We're trying to make people happy. And we tend to forget about what do we really want and making the decisions because only we are living our life. No one else is living our life. So we might as well choose what we want to do. You said you like being able to talk to veterinarians about how they would like life to look and making a life that they're excited about. So how did that evolve? So how did your career kind of evolve into doing more of that?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was at that point of thinking, I'm going to leave clinical veterinary medicine, but I hadn't left it yet. And I hadn't really talked to many people about it, but I was working with a personal coach. And this was kind of a blended like real estate coach / personal development / life coach. And we were working on I was like, I had decided I wanted to leave, but I just didn't have the courage to do it. And we were doing a coaching call and I had my head down and I'm looking down and not looking up. By the time I look up on screen, he's whiteboarding the conversation and he has 3 dates on the screen. And he just said to me, pick one. And he wouldn't let it go. And I was like, well, what do you mean pick one? He's like, pick one of these dates. And I was like, well, what are they for? And he's like, pick one. So I picked one. And he's like, that's the date you're handing in your resignation letter. Because now, just for context here, this wasn't a one-off conversation. Like we had been working together for probably 2 years at this point. We were speaking weekly or bi-weekly. So it wasn't just some guy out of the blue. Like he knew me well. And when I made that decision, it was so freeing to finally just commit to it and circle it and be like, there. And he made me type up my letter that right as soon as we got off the call, send it to him, sign it, date it. Now the only thing handed in when that date arrived. And it was honestly just weight melting off my shoulder. And then I went and I was working out. It was nice here. So I was working out outside on our rower. And I remember I did a really hard workout. I kind of fell off the rower at the end and I was laying there and I was like, how many other veterinarians feel this way? Right. And I was like, there's got to be tons of us. I'm not the only one. Every time I'd have a coffee conversation with someone, and it would come around that way, people would talk about wow, there's a lot of pressure right now. I'm really feeling it. And that's when the idea of our podcast that me and Jonathan are doing for me started. Me and Jonathan are best friends. I reached out to him and he's like, I've been wanting to do something like this too. And so then we were like, well, let's launch a podcast. And, we have no idea really where it was going to go other than we wanted to impact other veterinarians. So that was kind of like the evolution of how I came around to that side of things.
Yeah. And so you've been doing the podcast now, you said a couple years?
I think it's 2 years. I'd have to check, but it's got to be close to that.
Yeah. So, and you do all sorts of formats. You bring on guests, you and Jonathan will talk back and forth. I listened to the episode this morning and it was one where it was just you and Jonathan. And so what are some of the things that you have learned just doing this podcast?
Okay, good question. About my veterinary industry, or where do we want to go with this?
I mean, you could go anywhere. Something you've learned about yourself, something you've learned about the veterinary industry. I'm curious about it all.
Okay. For myself, one thing I learned was just how much I love the connection piece. So I am an introvert for sure, right? I recharge like in my office solo, doing like thinking and reading and that kind of stuff. Being said, when we jump on a Zoom call with a guest that's anywhere in the world and I get to hear their story and what they're doing and what they're going through and their ideas and what they're excited about, I love it. Like it just fuels me up. So I learned about myself just how much I love the connection with other veterinarians. And I always thought I was in the veterinary industry for the animals. And it's like I said, I like animals, but wow, do I really love the connection piece with the people. For a broader stroke of the veterinary community, one of the most common themes that we see come up with our guests is curiosity. Mm-hmm. And so I honestly, we should keep a running scorecard of how many guests somehow mention that somewhere in their journey. And it just keeps coming up. So many people pivot what they thought they were going to do in vet school or in years 1, 2, 3 out. It ends up changing and they pivot and their career ebbs and flows. And the thread through all of that is curiosity, right? And they step into that and they find things that light them up even more, that they're more passionate about. And so all of the, I would say successful veterinarians that we interview, it's curiosity. They just don't stop. They never turn that off, and I'm kind of rambling here, but going back when I was in that like trough of miserable Mike, when I self-reflect, I temporarily lost that, right? Like I lost that desire when a complex case would come in. I was no longer curious about like, what's going on here? This isn't a straightforward case. And I would just default to like, we better refer this, get this off my plate. I don't want to deal with it. Like I stopped stepping into the challenge and I stopped being curious. And that the sort of burnout in my career really flared up.
When I came on the podcast for you was talking about curiosity. So I'm just another statistic there, but no, I think it's true. Which is so interesting because I always think of ourselves like we are scientists. What are scientists? They're curious. They're constantly asking questions. And so I think that's a really good perspective of maybe a sign of burnout is the loss of curiosity. You're just trying to get through the day instead of really, like you said, coming into the challenge. Now, some people in practice right now are wondering, do I have the luxury of curiosity or do I just have to get through the next day? So what are some of the things that you're finding and talking with many veterinarians in today that you feel could be helpful in continuing this profession? I mean, I've heard people downright say they're worried about the survival of the profession. So what are some of your encouragements to the people currently in clinic?
Okay. Top of mind for me probably would be 2 things. Number one, everyone has unique gifts. right? There's just going to be things that you're good at, that you like doing, that when you're doing them, you're more in flow. Now, don't get me wrong. Veterinary medicine is there's going to be days that are hard. There's going to be challenging cases. There's going to be things that go wrong. So what I'm not saying here is, you can find a path that is easy. That's not it at all. But there is a path that is more in alignment with what you like doing and what your gifts are. And so I think people, if you're feeling a bit burnt out or you're feeling that curiosity slipping, sometimes taking a step back and broadening a little bit and seeing, okay, because like how many options do we have as veterinarians? Like we're so blessed. Like it's unreal,
the reason for the podcast, my podcast.
Yeah. Like I can't think of a profession where one degree allows you to do so much. Like there is really no rules. So if option one is not working for you, step back and pick one of the other hundreds of options, right? There's nothing that says you got to keep slamming into that brick wall. So that would be the first thought that comes to mind, is stepping back, getting some clarity and finding something that aligns for you more, finding an environment that aligns for you more, and seeing how that works out. The second one, and this is kind of one of the things I'm a big proponent of, is I think the volume oftentimes is just too much. Like I don't know how we got to the place where if you aren't working 60 or 70 hours a week and coming in on your days off, then you're not a good quality veterinarian. Like somehow that just kept ramping up and became like a badge of honor where it's like, that's what's expected. And this is a really broad stroke. This is not every veterinary clinic everywhere at all. It's just, I hear it enough that it's obviously out there that I really think like we just have to be a little more gentler on ourselves and turn that volume dial down. And when I was working part-time, it was a very loose part-time. So, some days I'd work 6 days a week, some days I'd work 3, I'd ramp up and down as the clinic required. But I told them my goal here is like, when I can, I only want to come in 3 days a week. And I can't tell you, like, those weeks are beautiful. Like they're just absolutely totally different than weeks where you're just crammed in like Monday to Friday or Monday to Saturday nonstop. Like when you get that time to reset and recharge, it changes everything. I honestly think you are a better veterinarian.
Now, I mean, I can't help but hear people say, but our caseload is so heavy that if I don't, that there will be pets unserved. So what are you thinking about when it comes to the workplace crisis? I think I heard that term the other day and it's like, wow, what a term, right? The workplace crisis where we don't have enough people. At least that's what they're talking about. How do we step back and not work 80 hours a week and still feel like we are serving the pets? I think it's probably a mix, right? Yes. Again, back to the types of people who come in. We're hard workers. We want to work hard. But we also want to serve our clients and our patients. So if we are feeling like we're constantly having clients and patients walk through the door, how do we find the balance?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't have the answer for that. And what I'm about to say is probably going to piss some people off. Because I'm coming at it from a place of, if you don't protect yourself, then you just won't be there, in the future to serve any clients. So sort of my theory is having the moderate caseload over, say, a 30-year career versus the most intense 10 years you can possibly cram in. You're probably going to see and serve more cases over 30 years if you have that staying power. Right? Like we're not doing anyone any favors by running them as hard as we can for 10 years until they just break down and leave the profession. Right? So we're creating that attrition. So I know that doesn't solve the problem of tomorrow when veterinary clinics across the country are jam-packed with cases. It doesn't get solved that quick. my opinion is if we can start to like change that narrative, and start to keep people in longer, and obviously we need to bring more people in. That would be a partial solution, but bring them in and have them stay, that would be my hope.
I like this. It's a long-term mindset, right? When you get too short-sighted and you're just thinking about tomorrow, you forget that if you constantly are doing a day like that, you're not going to have a total number of days. And some concerns, and I spoke not too long ago with a veterinary technician who is looking at the statistics of people coming into veterinary technician school, and they are declining. And I can't exactly blame them, because when you poll the number of veterinarians these days or veterinary technicians, would you recommend this profession to a family member or a friend? A large percent, a shocking percent, say no. So I don't think it's really helping in the long-term recruiting either, is it? So I know I asked you a really hard question, so thank you for bearing with me. I think there are multiple answers to this. I think it's not easy and it takes time, and sometimes patience is not our strong suit, but I think it is. It's that long-term mindset and knowing that we can't just think about tomorrow. It has to be a long-term strategy. And I'm glad that we do have a lot of people who are trying to think about these and to work on potential solutions. Well, hello. That is part 1 with Michael Bugg. And I completely forgot to say happy anniversary. This is the 1-year anniversary of Vet Life Reimagined, and we continue to grow. We can't do it without you being here with us. So please share the podcast with others and come back Friday morning to get part 2 with Dr. Michael Bugg. You'll get the behind the scenes into his book, and we'll start talking about growing a healthy money mindset. I always put the references in the description below, and I will see you later this week.